Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In today's first segment, we're going to discuss the four-point plan that had been agreed upon between the United States and Iran, seemingly with the mediation of France, of course, in part that Tehran would not seek nuclear weapons, would abide by regional peace, would help to contribute to peace, and in exchange for all of that, the U.S. would lift all sanctions against Tehran and allow for Iranian exports, quote unquote, immediately. Now, of course, as we know, that plan fell apart essentially at the United Nations General Assembly as Macron had wanted Rouhani and Trump to meet at the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. That meeting did not occur because Donald Trump went into the his UN speech, threatening Iran with even severer sanctions and punishment, quote unquote, as he put it. So let's discuss all of that a bit further. There have obviously been developments in these recent days as well in that regard, but Iran sticking by its narrative that all sanctions must be lifted and permanent solutions now must be found to this issue so that Iran's economy and otherwise can recover properly. Let's now introduce some of our guests who are joining us to discuss this a bit further. We're joined now by Hans-Jakob Schindler, who is a former German official who served in Iran, in fact, between 2005 and 2011. He's joining us now from New York. We're also joined by Ahmed Hashemi, who is a Washington-based Iranian journalist and expert on Middle East and global geopolitical trends. He's currently joining us from Madrid, where he's traveling to. Ahmed and Hans, thank you both for your time today. Hans, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What do you make of this plan, A, and why it fell apart? How does this reflect on the U.S.?
As you know, there is a negotiation situation 2 years since the administration stopped, first then completely left the JCPOA. Obviously, the fall apart because of the announcements. As you may recall, through the UN General Assembly meeting, just John Bolton as national was let go by President Trump. There was on oil and gas infrastructure also for which Iran either directly, depending on what side of the argument you believe, is clearly responsible. A response from the United States. The attack came at a very innovative. The efforts to develop the four-point plan and to arrange for the meeting by France has been ongoing for several. If you remember, Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif invited to the G7 meeting in preparation for the meeting. So this was not some last-minute effort to the ground, but long prepared, and argued that the firing was related to making sure that the meeting.
All right, so Ahmed, what are your thoughts on that? Because, this has long negotiated, certainly. Obviously, these things do not happen overnight, certainly, such plans. It fell apart, according to Rouhani, because of Donald Trump. Is that a fair statement?
That I'm not sure, but I believe Iran is rather interested in 1 point out of these 4 points, and that is the total lifting of United States sanctions against Iran. The other 3, which is abandoning nuclear program, abiding by regional peace, again, depending on what do we mean with regional peace. If that means having a peaceful relationship with Israel, with even Saudi Arabia and some other Gulf countries, I doubt it. And again, if contributing to the peace in the region, regional peace, that I'm not sure if that means, limiting and restricting itself to its national boundaries. Again, I'm not sure about that. Iran believes in Shiite spread or Bilat Faqih system spread, or Shiite expansionism and Islamist agenda is on its foreign policy. So I'm not sure if Iran is interested in those 3 points, but absolutely it is interested in 1 point, and that is the total removal of the sanctions. And also United States, I think U.S. too is not interested in negotiating a genuine and sincere negotiation, as the Donald Trump administration stepped away from the nuclear deal and Now, the New Deal that United States aspires of, it includes total denuclearization. It includes removal of Iran's missile program, and it includes Iran's limitations on Iran's regional ambitions, which are for now are kind of impossible from Iran's perspective. And also, the U.S. maximum pressure works, so the United States doesn't need the field to put emphasis on the negotiations.
All right, so Hans, this puts, I imagine, the Europeans in a tough spot, isn't it? And the Europeans have been in a tough corner, seemingly, from day one when the United States walked away from the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. How do you and what do you think Europe, what will Europe be doing going forward? Because it seems that Instex and all those measures taken by Europe were not enough. Can Europe really actually realistically save this nuclear deal? Can it really stand up to the U.S. is basically what I'm asking.
Well, first of all, let's just make the point clear. While there is a difference of opinion on how to approach Iran, in particular on the role of the JCPOA, there is very great difference about the characterization and its regional behavior between the United States. Obviously, we do need progress on the other issues beyond the JCPOA. That's why the French have been trying to find some kind of a compromise solution missile program. So there is no great. In addition, while I argue that the United States is not in coming to a negotiation with Iran, one also has to acknowledge that this U.S. administration, surprisingly, been extremely measured in its responses to some of the actions that the Iranian regime took in the last couple of months to take and resolve. If I may just was in a U.S. military drone by Iran, and the administrations would not have fought to this military. So while we see escalation in Iranian to demonstrate that the maximum pressure campaign has also a price for the other side, there's still been a fairly measured response from the U.S., continuing to prioritize pressure over in military response. This, of course, leaves it open for negotiation. Both sides need to walk through this. And unfortunately, this time, I believe it's readier than the Iranian counterparts were at the U.S.
But then, in the middle of all this, certainly, Hans, as you can imagine, is the realities on the ground in Iran itself. I mean, no president in Iran can be seen to be continually giving more and more of a compromise, especially at a time that the economy continues to suffer more and more, even though, of course, as you know, Rouhani keeps saying, listen, our economy is doing better now in comparison to where it was possibly not too long ago, where the currency was quite dismal in its exchange rate as well as the inflation rate. There has to be some realistic way of approaching that situation. Absolutely.
Obviously, Rouhani very skillfully used the sanctions pressure to necessary reforms in the financial system, the taxation system, which would be more painful if he could have not, attributed the economic hardships that to a certain extent fell on the Iranian population by referring to the sanctions. So anyway, they smartly use the sanctions to do some economic reforms that they may have been able to do otherwise. To your question of whether the Europeans can save the JCPOA, the big problem, of course, is that the European economy is not a state-led economy. So from the European Union side, and especially from the E3, so Germany and the UK, everything has been done. So there has been a block that tries to shield European companies from bilateral of other states, including the United States. There have been, as you already mentioned, the setting up of Instex against enormous US pressure to make sure that transfers can be done. And of course, something that is a little bit not misunderstood, there's been quite resistance against Iran becoming again part of the blacklist, which would make financial transfers more complicated. So the European the political and legal side has done what it can, not order companies to. So we need to go from point to point B here, and that is with the United States. There is no point in not acknowledging that there is diplomatic aspects to a role, and we need to compromise on this.
Indeed. But just before we go to break, Ahmed, get your thoughts before we let you go about what you think will Europe be able to do at this point in time, because that seems to have been at least Iran's narrative in all this. Even Ayatollah Khamenei has said Europe is not doing enough. That seems to be the across the board understanding within Iranian officials and the Iranian establishment. A, is that a fair statement? And B, do you think Europe should be doing more?
I think there are few things that there are limited things that the United States can do, because the European Union can do, because we know the bigger the larger shares are in stake, and the European Union and its companies, they cannot compromise and they cannot risk the larger share, which is the United States market, as the largest world economy. So they cannot actually make United States disappointed in terms of having the economic ties with the Iranian government and Iranian companies. So in text, I think it's one example of how Europe is unable or is limited in sacrificing or in rather satisfying Iran's demands or meeting Iran's needs in terms of its foreign relations, in terms of its economic dealings. So I think there is the very limited possibility and capacity by the European side when it comes to relieving sanctions or helping Iran help itself economically, and of course in terms of international relations and isolation.
Okay, I'm going to say thank you to Ahmed there, and I'm going to ask Hans to stay with us. We're going to our first break, viewers. We'll be right back after this break, continuing this discussion, of course, on how this possible meeting between Trump and Rouhani fell apart. Thank you for staying with us, viewers, here in Scope. We're going to continue to discuss the issue of course, Iran-U.S. talks or potential talks that fell apart, of course, as had been tried by the French President Emmanuel Macron. We're still joined by Hans-Jakob Schindler, who's a former German official who served in Iran between 2005 and 2011. He's still with us now on the line from New York, but we're adding two new voices to the conversation. We're now joined by Hamidreza Gholamzadeh, who is a foreign policy expert. He's joining us from the Iranian capital, Tehran. And joining us from the French capital, Paris, is Kourosh Shamlou, who's an international law expert. He's managing partner at Shamlou Law. Kourosh and Hamidreza, as well as Hans, thanks for your time, of course. Hamidreza, I wanted to start with you in this segment and ask you, what do you make of Rouhani essentially saying that it's essentially Trump's fault that potential talks between the U.S. and Iran over the nuclear deal fell apart because of Donald Trump himself?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. Actually, there are two people who essentially need the JCPOA or any further deals between Iran and the United States, and there are two presidents, President Rouhani and President Trump. President Trump needs a foreign achievement to actually show that he has some program in his foreign policy, and President Rouhani needs to actually save JCPOA to actually keep it as his own legacy coming to the last years of his presidency. But the point is that despite this enthusiasm by President Rouhani, the situation in New York was in a way that he could not actually accept any talks or any deals. The point is that President Trump just wants a photo stand-up or some negotiations, not any results or in that. While on the other hand, President Rouhani needs something real and on the ground. It needs changes on the ground that can change their lives in Iran. It needs something that people can feel in the country. So just signatures, just standing together, shaking hands, or even a phone call is not something that President Rouhani is after. The items that have been revealed and released to the media actually show that the point is that President Rouhani, I think correctly, demands the United States to publicly and officially announce that they are going to, let's say, the sanctions are actually removed, and then Iran will accept further steps.
Okay, so
it didn't happen in New York.
Right. So Kourosh, tell us about the French role in all this, because obviously Emmanuel Macron was the one who was trying to negotiate this meeting between the Iranian and American presidents. Do you think that Macron had a bit of a naive approach to all of this, thinking that America would actually accept the lifting of all sanctions?
I think President Macron is playing a very big role. But as you said, it's a bit naive, because with Donald Trump, you never know what his reasoning is, because he says that he's ready to talk and sit with the Iranian and talk with the President Rouhani. And then when he goes and he gives his speech, he doubles down on the sanction. He says, we're going to double down the sanction. So you never know what President Trump is thinking. President Macron is very close to Donald Trump, and he tries to move Donald Trump toward peace. But it's really hard, because you never know with Donald Trump, you never know with Mike Pompeo what they want to do. But there are some new approaches, because as you know, Japan just opened a line of credit of around 15 billion or 20 billion for Iran in order to export Iran oil to Japan and have a line of credit. And I think they couldn't do that without American approval before. So Macron is playing a good role. We never know. But I think President Rouhani was right not to meet Donald Trump, as my colleague just said, not to meet with Donald Trump, because he doesn't want to shake hands. He needs the sanction to be lifted. And he wants to show the Americans that even if they put sanctions, even if they double down on the sanctions, Iran will not lay over and will not just go and sit on the table. Yeah. We need the sanctions to be lifted, and then we can start negotiating as equal partner.
Okay, so then Hans, it really comes down to this issue of sanctions, doesn't lifting of all sanctions. This is, of course, as you well know, being highlighted in the nuclear deal as well. That did not, of course, occur, and we can even go back to the Obama tenure as well, regarding the issue of sanctions and how the U.S. didn't really hold up its end of the bargain. This, of course, according to the Iranians. What do you make of that? And do you think it's ever actually realistic for us to expect that the United States will lift all sanctions on Iran?
Well, thank you very much. Again, we are talking a little bit, looking at the situation partially. This latest sanction round is actually the best possible outcome created by a situation that was not of the U.S. or the European making. I might remind your viewers again, there was a massive attack taking 5% of the oil production of the globe off the market just before the UN General Assembly. And no one can tell me that this was not a very deliberate timing of the attack happening just before the UN General Assembly. So, with all due respect, this latest sanctions round had a clear reason, and the EU3 did say so, that, and I can guarantee you that this was not a statement made lightly, that they see Iranian responsibility for the attack. So while there is a general disagreement between Europe and the United States concerning the continuation of the JCPOA in its current form, it is absolutely clear that this latest sanction round did not meet European resistance, because there was a clear responsibility allocated to Iran, either directly, if you believe the American side of the story, or even indirectly, because Iran has been positioning itself as a great supporter and sponsor of the Houthi movement for many years. And if the Houthis, if you believe the Iranian story, are directly and solely responsible for this attack, then Iran as a sponsor at least bears indirect responsibility. So in any way, this was an escalation of a situation that was unnecessary, and the timing was apparently very deliberate just before the United Nations General Assembly. So this was a very unhelpful move.
Okay, and point taken. Sure, go ahead, Hans. Go ahead, Hans.
It is to get to the negotiation table, but both sides need to get to the table.
Okay, so Hamidreza, let's talk about that attack then, because Hans, we need to contextualize the situation, right? So that attack that took place on the Saudi oil facilities, especially in the lead up right to the United Nations General Assembly, certainly not a helpful move. Whether it was just the Houthi movement in Yemen which carried out that attack, or more direct Iranian involvement, either way, it doesn't reflect well on Iran, does it?
Iran was not responsible for the attacks on Aramco, and no evidence shows that, and we have the Houthis claiming the responsibility. So I don't think that there is any point in discussing Iran's responsibility in that, because Iran didn't have any responsibility. If the United States wants to put pressure and sanctions on any reasons, that's a different story. You cannot say that, okay, Houthis have actually done the attack, so we are going to punish Iran. So we have a lot of such things in the world. We have Saudi Arabia killing and actually carrying out a genocide in Yemen. And we know all the European countries and the United States are actually some sort of helping that. By selling the weapons and intelligence and such things. So
but then certainly, Hamid, if I may come in for a moment, because certainly in the lead up to the UN General Assembly, I mean, I imagine that if the Iranians were aware of such an attack to even occur, really, that they would have probably stopped it. I mean, I'm trying to understand the logic here of allowing such an attack, especially at a time when Iran was like, listen, the Europeans need to do more. The US needs to lift all sanctions. Like, in that political atmosphere where Iran really wants, obviously, the nuclear deal to survive, why allow for this attack, even, again, just by the Houthis?
There is a presumption in the question that Iran is responsible in one way or the other in the attack. The point is that there is no connection between Iran and the attack on Aramco. The Yemenis carried out the attack, first of all, because they had been under pressure for 5 years. Second, the Aramco was going to sell its, actually to go for sale, and it was just ahead of that date. We are actually ignoring that part of the opening of the Aramco stocks. So that's the point. Connecting Aramco to the timing of the UN General Assembly, I think, has the preassumption that Iran was in one way or the other involved in the attack, which I do not believe that at all happened. So there is no connection between them. You cannot say that if the attack was carried out, it shows that Iran did not want to actually save the JCPOA, or there are elements inside Iran that want to actually kill the JCPOA. I don't know whatsoever it is. I don't see actually any connection between the 2 points.
Okay, Kourosh, give us your thoughts there for sitting in Paris. Do you think that it is fair to question Iranian actions in the region, be it vis-a-vis the Saudi oil facilities attack, or even before that when it came to the ships, the oil tankers, and other such activities in the region? Is that fair then for Europe to say, listen, Iranian activities as well in the region have not been helpful, and we need to punish Iran for that?
I think Europe is right, and to question that. But I think there's a logic behind that, behind the Iranian move. It's the Houthi who launched the attack. But Iran, just before the General Assembly, wanted to show, I think, its power. Iran has no other choice. And to show the American, it's either you come and sit on the table and we negotiate, or if you don't want, we need to go to war. I mean, you need to go to war against us. I think if you listen to what exactly President Rouhani said at the General Assembly, it was a buffet. It was a lending hand and a threat. He said that we need to make peace, and he said Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, we need to make a peace between the countries in this region. We don't need the big brother to come and defend you. And on the other hand, that it was a threat, and saying that to the Saudis that if you can't on the Americans, they're not gonna send their boys to be killed here for you. So it's either you're going to make peace with us, we can have peace around this country, around the Persian Gulf, or it's going to be a war. And as you saw, Saudi Arabia is approaching Iran and wants to start negotiating peace with Iran or some kind of a peace movement. And United Arab Emirates did the same. I think there's a big logic, and Iran wants to show its power and say, if you don't negotiate with us, there's only one way left. It's going to be war. It's whether you Americans, you're ready to come here and start a big war or not. For me, there's the logic behind the Iranian approval of the Houthi attack.
But that's dangerous logic, though, isn't it, Kourosh? Because, again, the Iranians might push too hard.
Iran cannot export its oil anymore. Iran economy is falling down, so you don't have any other choice. And when the Iranians shot one of the American drones, the United States didn't show any move, because they know if they do something, they have to go to war. So it's a dangerous path, but I think it's the only path to do that. Europeans like President Macron is trying, but they cannot push the European companies to go to invest in Iran, because they are scared of the Americans, and they will not invest in Iran unless the Americans give them approval. And they want, and the most important thing, they want the Congress to lift their sanctions. Not only America, because you have the American sanction, but it's divided by two: the executive branch and the Congress branch. So I think that's the only path. It's a dangerous path, but I think it's a good path. Iran has no other choice.
Okay, we'll have to leave there as a final word, as concluding remarks. But of course, we appreciate all of our guests throughout this segment. We were joined there by Hans-Jakob Schindler, Hamidreza Gholamzadeh, and Kourosh Shamlou. And earlier, we were also joined by Ahmed Hashemi as well. We, of course, appreciate the context that all of our guests have brought to this discussion. We try to, of course, get guests from both sides of the argument, and, of course, to be able to give a balanced view to our viewers. This is certainly a complex issue. Iran finds itself in a corner and may very well be, from the American perspective or even the European perspective, acting out in some way. But for Iran, it would say, listen, we're just defending ourselves. We're trying to make the point that you can't just limit our oil exports, our economy, our presence really in this region in any way, shape or form without any consequences of any sorts. And the Americans, of course, as I've already pointed out, would say, listen, Iranian activities in the region are not helpful, be it towards Yemen or otherwise. And then, of course, we have the Europeans in the middle, the French president trying to negotiate that meeting at the United Nations General Assembly, the 4-point plan presented, which President Rouhani of Iran apparently accepted, according to his own words. But then Donald Trump came into the UN blasting and saying that, listen, we may be placing further sanctions or quote-unquote punishment on Iran for its activities, especially in the wake, of course, that attack on Aramco in Saudi Arabia. So again, a complex situation, but a very risky one, as Kourosh there said as well. Certainly the possibility of war does loom very large in the region. No one wants it, but one miscalculation could very well start a war. We'll keep a very close eye on that situation in this region. I'll be back with my last segment after this break. Stay tuned. Viewers, thank you for staying with us here in Scope. In this segment, we're going to discuss now the U.S.-EU trade war. We talk a lot about the U.S.-China trade war, but there is a number of trade wars that the United States seems to find itself in nowadays. And the U.S. has just recently won approval from the WTO to impose tariffs on about $7.5 billion worth of European goods. This is all over what the U.S. has called illegal EU subsidies to the aviation company, of course, Airbus, threatening to trigger, of course, tit-for-tat transactions or transatlantic trade war, The Europeans have, of course, warned that they may very well go through and ask that the subsidies possibly that are given to Boeing are also taken into account to win it approval for tariffs on then American goods. And certainly this doesn't help either side. And there are a number of goods, and we can obviously list them off. But this would hurt the Europeans certainly, and comes down to things like wine and cheese and et cetera. I can obviously, like I said, go down the list. At this point, then this also goes back to then, is this what we want future trade to look like around the world? Is this positive for Americans themselves? Is this the best way for Donald Trump to put America first? A lot, of course, to digest when it comes to this issue, and it's quite complex as well at certain points. But let's discuss this a bit further with our guests who are joining us now. We're joined by Oana Popescu-Zamfir, who is the director of Global Focus Center, which is an independent foreign policy think tank. She's also the former State Secretary of Romania for EU Affairs. She's joining us now from Bucharest in Romania itself. We're also joined from Heidelberg in Germany by Dr. Christian Johannes Bluth, who is a trade economist with Global Economic Dynamics of Bertelsmann Stiftung. Christian and Oana, thank you both for your time this morning. Oana, let me start with you, if I may. What do you make of this announcement? What do you make of the WTO approval of these tariffs? Do they have a point about subsidies to Airbus?
Well, look, the first thing I'm going to say is just to quote one of the chefs who I understand owns a lot of restaurants in the U.S. And he said, if you're a deal maker, and obviously he was talking about Donald Trump, then negotiate with allies first, make deals with allies first before you do that with enemies. So essentially, the main thing to watch out for is indeed, as you said, is this what we want? The EU so far has reacted by saying, on the one hand, on behalf of the European Commission, Commissioner Malmström for trade was saying imposing tariffs now to retaliate would be silly. On the other hand, different member states that are being hurt are actually considering retaliation. So this is, I think, that the first thing that I would like to highlight. Other than that, I guess the WTO does have a point. I'm in no position to judge the actual verdict itself. But the EU has been saying, on the other hand, that Boeing was enjoying similar facilities, so that it wouldn't necessarily be fair that now the U.S. is retaliating in response to the EU subsidizing Airbus. The one thing I guess to take away is legally and from the point of view of who's right and who's wrong, both sides, or alternatively, one or the other might be, but the thing is, this is political. This is not just about trade. This is not just about legal terms. This is about two countries two blocks, the U.S. economy and the EU economy, that together make up for over half of the world economy. These economies are tightly integrated, and this is more political, I think, than it is at this point, economic.
That's a good point, isn't it, Christian? Because again, obviously, as trade and politics, certainly they're pretty much just mixed or minced meat, I should say. There's always that mix and overlap in both worlds. But how do you view this? Because is this just down to the numbers and the tariffs and Airbus versus Boeing, or is this much bigger than that, as you wanted to put out?
Well, I think this is actually bigger than that. Because I think the first thing that is notable about this, that this is different from how the US has been conducting its trade war policy under Trump and in other instances. It's not, and they don't act in the way as they did vis-a-vis China, where they just imposed tariffs out of their own discretion because they felt that we needed. Here, they actually stick to the multilateral trading system. They do operate on the grounds of the rules of the World Trade Organization. And so this is not something that destroys the foundations of the world trading system, but it actually shows that the system that it's currently designed is working. That's one point to make. The other is we do see an increasing tendency, not only in Europe, but also in other areas in the world, that countries believe they need to be technologically sovereign. They need to be able to have capabilities in certain products, and the aero industry is certainly amongst them. And that is the reason why in Europe, but also in the US and in China, as far as I know, these are heavily subsidized industries.
Yeah.
And The difficulty, obviously, when you have a heavily subsidized industry is to organize it in a way that it is not distorting competition too much.
Okay, so then Ioana, this goes to the heart of the issue then, isn't it? Because Donald Trump came into office and he was unapologetic about saying, listen, I'm going to put America first. So then this then becomes the argument, I imagine, at some level between protectionism and globalization. Where does Europe then lie when it comes to that argument? And it's sort of just like, as you had obviously already alluded to in your first answer, it's sort of forced to respond, isn't it? Because you do have to then protect yourself as an economic bloc too.
Yeah, in a way, it is forced to respond. I think in the longer run, if you look at it this way, I think in the short term, I would very much agree with Commissioner Malmström. I would say no, it's not forced to respond right away. I think it would be much smarter to try, and I think really we need to keep trying to get the U.S. back to the negotiating table. I think there's, the EU is kind of doomed to be a multilateral actor, but I think it can only be successful if it does so together with the U.S. And I think it's in our mutual interest to go back to Washington and to try to talk some sense into the administration. I know that's been done unsuccessfully until now. I know there's growing frustration in the EU, in all capitals. However, if we're going to escalate this, I don't think we're going to be better off on either side. So again, in the long run, indeed, if Washington does not cease to take this adversarial view of world trade, if it continues to focus on nationalistic policies rather in trade rather than globalistic policies, then indeed the EU is going to be forced to respond. But I think we need to delay that response and to try and use all other means before we do that.
And then if I go to politics for a moment, because I imagine that the U.S., for example, would not want Europe to have further trade or more trade with the likes of Russia, for example, which it may very well need to if, of course, its hand is forced vis-a-vis tougher trade with the United States, be it when it comes to energy needs or otherwise, because as we know, that was an issue for a while as well, and still is an issue, dependency on Russian energy. Do you think that in many ways that America is almost sort of hitting itself over the head with a hammer when it comes to its interests vis-a-vis Europe?
Yeah, I think so, and I think with really such results showing even in the short run, I understand. Already there have been reactions at home in the U.S. to the tariffs, signaling that they're hurting the U.S. economy, or at least some parts of it, as much as they're hurting the EU economy. But yeah, indeed, undermining the alliance, I don't think is necessarily in Washington's interest. But this is not the first instance that it's done that. I think we're living through a time of kind of global reconsiderations of whether globalization as we know it is over and what is the next stage. And I think it is, the U.S. is making the mistake of trying to negotiate, to play tough, hoping that it's going to get more in doing so, rather than in the long run continuing to build the alliance with the EU so that it can play tough with those that really sometimes perhaps need that kind of strategy. Okay. But I am hoping for wisdom on the part of the European Union, and I am hoping that we're going to try to explain to American partners why this is a mistake.
Okay, so Christian, I'm going to ask you a very, very basic question. Do you think that globalization actually need to be revisited, redesigned, however I would term it, but do you think that possibly it hasn't been as successful as it's been sold to the rest of us around the world?
Well, I think there's certainly aspects of globalization and the rule book by which it is governed that need to be reformed and restructured. One important element is, we do have a rule book at the World Trade Organization, and we need a system that is capable of enforcing these rules. But the ruling we have seen on the Airbus-Boeing case is actually one of the last ones that can be made by the appellate body of the WTO, because since the US have been blocking the nomination of new judges, this body will become dysfunctional by the end of this year. And this is a logical place to start. I mean, we need the right rules in place, but we also need a dispute settlement that works. And the US blocking it is a very destructive action and basically vandalism on a global public good.
Okay, so then if we're talking about restructuring, then what are the trouble spots, do you think, Christian, when it comes to globalization? Because again, the U.S. the Trump narrative from day one is that the international community, and he's not being very nice when it comes to the EU and how it's treated the U.S. Again, in his point of view, when it comes to trade, saying continuously that the U.S. has been treated unfairly. Is he correct?
To some degree. I mean, there are lots of points in the way global trade works that are contentious. Overall, we know that trade has actually had a fairly positive effect. And I would say that the US have actually gained more from trade than they have lost from unfair trade practices. Nevertheless, they have a point in saying we need to discuss the way countries do industrial subsidies and industrial policies. They do have a point in saying that countries declaring themselves to be developing countries that are obviously not, like Taiwan or Singapore and so on, is not a helpful practice. And that means they're exempt from some rules. So I think what would be the correct response is that the US reaches out to like-minded partners, and that would include the EU, and together with them actually forces other actors, notably China, to the negotiation table and says, okay, China has benefited more than anyone else from joining the WTO, so it's only fair that they adapt some of their practices in a way that their system is compatible with the world trading system. That's the correct approach, and I think the most promising one. Fighting trade wars is likely to be most destructive for both parts and not really yielding anything so far.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final word, but of course we appreciate both Christian for their time today, and of course for putting this all into context for us. This can be sometimes, of course, a very complicated and confusing issue, but we of course appreciate both of their time and insight on this topic. Viewers, we always talk, and we talk often, in fact, globally as well, about the China-U.S. trade war, but we tend to ignore the fact that the U.S. is going even after its own allies very strongly, as I said to Christian there as well, saying continuously that it's been treated unfairly. That's the Donald Trump statement that continues to come out whenever he talks about trade with any allies or foes around the world. Is this a good thing? Will this work out well for even the American consumer, for American businesses, for American investors, or other foreign investors in the U.S.? And what of the EU? I mean, has the EU been giving subsidies illegally to Airbus? That seems to have now been understood by the WTO. But then what of Boeing as well in the U.S.? That's also been receiving help from the federal government there. And certainly the EU will now be responding to this WTO ruling, demanding it can also be then given permission to place tariffs on American goods. So this tit for tat certainly not good for either side, but this realignment, restructuring, as Christian there and Oana there both put it, maybe it's necessary. Maybe we need to be going through this short-term pain for longer-term gain, and this already needs to be balanced out. We'll keep a very close eye on all of this, because certainly this does affect the world of politics too. As Oana there said, will the EU now step back and cooperate less with the United States on issues which may be of importance to it around the world, be it Russia or otherwise? I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks very much for watching.